Case number 11, now pending before this tribunal.
Each defendant will rise when his name is called and answer the questions asked him by the tribunal and speak directly into the microphone.
In 1985, President Ronald Reagan laid a wreath at a German military cemetery, honoring what he called victims of war, including 49 Waffen SS soldiers. How did the soldiers who conquered Europe for Hitler become victims in our history books? The answer lies in a lie so perfectly crafted, it fooled CIA analysts, Hollywood directors, and maybe even your high school history teacher. A lie written by Nazi generals themselves. In the wake of World War II, the victorious Allies faced the daunting task of prosecuting Nazi war crimes. Among the captives were top Wehrmacht generals who, instead of facing immediate trial, found themselves detained together at Camp Richie in Maryland. There, under unexpected circumstances, these military leaders orchestrated a narrative that would shape historical perceptions for decades. In the confined spaces of their prison, generals like Franz Halder, who served as the chief of the German Army General Staff during the war, spearheaded efforts to align their testimonies. They meticulously plotted a defense that would absolve the Wehrmacht of collective guilt, focusing war crimes accusations squarely on the SS and Adolf Hitler. This coordinated approach was pivotal. By the time of the Nuremberg trials, these unified stories were refined into a polished defense strategy. Halder, utilizing his influence and network, played a central role. He famously stated in a 1946 affidavit that the German army fought a clean fight, except for a few minor incidents instigated by Hitler himself. Such statements were strategically crafted to segregate the Wehrmacht from the SS's atrocities. This narrative found a receptive audience among those in the West, particularly in the United States, where Cold War tensions necessitated a re-evaluation of Germany as a potential ally against the Soviet Union. The generals' narratives were further disseminated through various writings and interviews. Heinz Guderian, another key figure and a pioneer of Germany's blitzkrieg tactics, published his memoirs, which perpetuated the myth of a clean Wehrmacht. These memoirs and other publications by Wehrmacht officers were laced with selective recollections and omissions, tailored to portray the regular German military as unsullied by the horrors of the Holocaust and civilian atrocities. This rewriting of history reached emotional peaks as these narratives were juxtaposed against the backdrop of the emerging Cold War. The American public and policymakers, grappling with the reality of needing Germany as a buffer against communism, were more than willing to accept a sanitized version of the Wehrmacht. This acceptance was crystallized when, during congressional hearings in 1951, General Omar Bradley, a senior U.S. military commander during the war, echoed the sentiment of many American officials by dismissing the idea of a uniformly criminal German army. However, to truly sell their innocence, the Wehrmacht generals required more than just aligned stories and sympathetic ears in American corridors of power. They needed the broader American public and influential cultural mediators to accept and propagate their sanitized version of history. This need laid the groundwork for their narratives to permeate American media and education, reshaping perceptions of the German military's role in World War II for generations to come. In the wake of World War II, as the Soviet threat loomed large with the Berlin blockade of 1948, the strategic importance of West Germany to NATO's defense plan became undeniably crucial. In this climate of burgeoning Cold War tensions, the U.S. Army found itself in a peculiar position of recruiting former Wehrmacht officers to aid in crafting its military strategies against the Soviet Union. Among these officers, Franz Halder stood out prominently. As the former chief of the German General Staff during the early years of World War II, Halder was appointed by the U.S. Army Historical Division to author a comprehensive study on the Eastern Front. The project aimed at gleaning valuable insights into Soviet military tactics, but inadvertently set the stage for these officers to revise their roles in the war. Halder, along with other Wehrmacht officers, worked meticulously on the military analyses, which not only detailed operational tactics, but also subtly painted the German military efforts in a more favorable light. This recharacterization suggested that the Wehrmacht was largely apolitical and primarily focused on strategic combat, conveniently understating the systemic military involvement in war crimes and the Holocaust. These narratives were later absorbed into mainstream academic and public discourses, significantly altering the perception of the German military's role during the war. By the mid-1950s, publications and speeches by these officers began echoing the sentiments of a clean Wehrmacht, which were further amplified by the lack of immediate public access to counter-archives and the pressing need of the Western Bloc to fortify Germany against communism. The influence of these rewritten histories reached its emotional peak when, in 1961, Halder was awarded the Meritorious Civilian Service Award by the United States, underscoring his and his colleagues' successful integration into the Western narrative framework. The award citation praised his contributions to the understanding of the Eastern Front, ignoring his World War II affiliations, and thereby completing his transformation from a Wehrmacht general to a respected Cold War analyst. This event marked a significant validation of the sanitized version of the Wehrmacht's history, which continued to be propagated amidst the geopolitical exigencies of the time. Armed with American typewriters and newfound credibility, these generals skillfully crafted a narrative that not only absolved them of their wartime roles, but also seduced Hollywood, leading to further perpetuation of the myth through popular films and television. This narrative reshaping served dual purposes. It sanitized their historical image and provided the U.S. with a staunch anti-communist ally in the heart of Europe, demonstrating a profound intersection of history, politics, and propaganda. As the Cold War intensified, Hollywood began to absorb and reiterate stories that pitted clear heroes against evident villains, a narrative style that conveniently aligned with U.S. anti-communist sentiments. Enter the 1951 film The Desert Fox, which portrayed General Erwin Rommel, played by James Mason, as an honorable soldier caught in the moral quagmire of Nazi Germany. The movie was based on the biography by Desmond Young, a British officer who briefly interacted with Rommel during the war. Young's portrayal, shaped partially by his own brief encounter and by accounts from German military officers, was instrumental in cementing Rommel's image as a chivalrous warrior opposed to Hitler's tyranny. This film, along with others like it, significantly contributed to the Clean Wehrmacht myth by drawing a sharp line between the Wehrmacht, depicted as professional soldiers, and the SS, cast as the true bearers of Nazi evil. In reality, this distinction was far murkier. Many Wehrmacht units were directly involved in war crimes, a fact that was downplayed or outright ignored in such cinematic portrayals. Historical records and testimonies, such as those found later in Soviet archives, tell a starkly different story, highlighting the involvement of the Wehrmacht in atrocities such as the mass shootings of Jews and the brutal suppression of civilians in occupied territories. This rewriting of history was not accidental. Several Nazi generals and former officers served as consultants in film productions, ensuring a portrayal of the German military that could engender sympathy and admiration. The involvement of these consultants helped embed a sanitized narrative into popular culture, an effect that was magnified by the film's international reach and popularity. One poignant first-hand account that contrasts sharply with Hollywood's portrayal comes from a private letter written by a Wehrmacht soldier dated 1941, which details the soldier's unit participating in the massacre of a village in Ukraine under direct orders from higher command. This account, like many others, was suppressed during the Cold War, as both East and West had vested interests in the simplified narrative of good versus evil. The impact of films like The Desert Fox on public perception was profound. They offered a seductive simplicity that obscured the complex and uncomfortable truths of the war. For many years, audiences around the world cheered for the noble German officer, Rommel, who was depicted as standing boldly against Hitler, all while the real evidence of the Wehrmacht's complicity in Nazi crimes remained buried in archives or dismissed as Soviet propaganda. This cinematic manipulation of history shows how powerfully film and media can shape public understanding and memory, often aligning more with contemporary political needs than with factual accuracy. The Wehrmacht's involvement in atrocities during World War II is starkly evidenced by the Barbarossa Decree, issued on May 13, 1941. This military directive, named after Operation Barbarossa, the code name for the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, explicitly removed legal protections for Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, sanctioning unprecedented acts of violence and brutality. The decree stated that no person in the occupied territories shall be immune from being punished by the German troops, effectively giving the green light for the Wehrmacht to commit crimes without fear of legal repercussions. The resulting impact was devastating. Historical records estimate that around 3.5 million Soviet POWs were murdered under the watch of the Wehrmacht. The complicity of the Wehrmacht in these war crimes is further documented through numerous first-hand accounts and military communications intercepted and archived by Allied forces. For instance, a communication from a Wehrmacht unit stationed near Kiev in 1941 coldly reports the execution of over 30,000 Jews in a single operation, carried out in conjunction with the SS. The report details the systematic rounding up of victims, their forced march to execution pits, and their subsequent mass shooting, a chilling operation that was part of a broader strategy of terror and extermination, endorsed and implemented by the Wehrmacht. This involvement was not limited to actions against Soviet prisoners of war and civilians. In territories like Greece, Yugoslavia, and Poland, the Wehrmacht enacted similar policies of terror. For example, in the Kragujevac massacre in October 1941, Wehrmacht soldiers executed nearly 2,800 civilians in retaliation for partisan attacks in occupied Yugoslavia. The massacre was meticulously planned and executed, illustrating the Wehrmacht's active role in such war crimes. A surviving witness, Milos Vasic, a school teacher at the time, recounted how soldiers methodically separated men and boys from their families, leading them away to their deaths. His testimony provides a harrowing personal perspective to the impersonal numbers. These actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic approach endorsed by high-level military orders and a culture of impunity fostered by Nazi military policies. The pervasive involvement of the Wehrmacht in such atrocities dismantles the myth of a clean Wehrmacht that was separate from the ideological and operational frameworks of the Nazi regime. Instead, it reveals a disturbing alignment with Hitler's genocidal ambitions, executed with efficiency and often zeal by regular army units across occupied territories. But it wasn't just in Russia where the Wehrmacht showed its true face. In Greece, Yugoslavia, and Poland, the regular army wrote its own rules of terror, further embedding the legacy of violence and brutality that characterized much of the Wehrmacht's operations throughout the war. The Wehrmacht's brutality in Yugoslavia starkly illustrates the scale of its atrocities under the guise of anti-partisan operations. By 1943, military directives no longer discriminated between partisans and the civilian population, leading to widespread massacres. In Kragujevac, Serbia, in October 1941, German soldiers executed nearly 2,800 civilians in a single day as retribution for attacks on German troops. This action was not isolated. Similar mass executions occurred across occupied territories. In Greece, the Distomo massacre of June 1944 saw 218 villagers slaughtered by the Wehrmacht, who left behind a village so decimated that it became a symbol of Nazi war crimes in Greece. These incidents were part of a broader strategy that equated guerrilla resistance with civilian complicity, thus justifying the industrial-scale murder of civilians. In Yugoslavia alone, scholars estimate that up to 1 million civilians were killed during the war, most at the hands of the Wehrmacht and SS units. The pervasive nature of these acts points to a systematic approach to what they called anti-partisan warfare, but which often amounted to genocide. For instance, archival records from the German military command in Yugoslavia detail an order that for every German soldier killed, 100 civilians were to be executed in retaliation. This policy resulted in numerous villages being wiped off the map, their populations decimated in cold blood. Historians like Edvard Radzinski have noted how these policies were not rogue actions, but directives from the highest levels of German command, intent on crushing any opposition through terror and violence. First-hand accounts from survivors and military documents add a grim depth to our understanding of these events. A report by a German officer in 1942 gloatingly detailed the burning of the village of Lidis in the Czech Republic, where men, women, and children were either shot or sent to concentration camps, their homes razed to the ground. This document chillingly noted, "The operation was carried out with exemplary efficiency and has had a salutary effect on the region." Such accounts reveal the chilling utilitarianism of Wehrmacht strategies, framed as military necessities. The emotional peaks of these narratives are found in the personal stories of the survivors. One poignant account from a survivor in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in France, where 642 civilians were massacred in June 1944, recounts, "The men were herded into barns which were then set ablaze. The women and children were locked in the church which was then blown up." The horror of these tactics, designed to instill terror and suppress resistance, underscores the brutal policy of collective punishment enacted by the Wehrmacht. For 40 years, these numbers and stories stayed hidden or minimized in the narrative of a clean Wehrmacht. But in 1995, a pivotal German exhibition would finally force the nation to confront the reality of its grandfather's war, challenging the sanitized version of history that had been propagated for decades. This exhibition laid bare the direct involvement of the Wehrmacht in wartime atrocities, sparking a national reckoning with the past. When the War of Annihilation exhibition opened its doors in Hamburg in 1995, it became a pivotal moment in German historical consciousness. The exhibition showcased over 1,400 photographs and other documents, many taken from personal albums of Wehrmacht soldiers themselves, which starkly depicted their involvement in war crimes across Eastern Europe. This visual evidence shattered the long-held belief in the innocence of the Wehrmacht, revealing their participation in executions, mass deportations, and the grim realities of the Holocaust. The exhibition, curated by Hannes Heer and titled Vernichtungskrieg, Verbrechen der Wehrmacht, 1941 bis 1944, War of Annihilation, Crimes of the Wehrmacht, 1941 bis 1944, drew unprecedented crowds. Over 500,000 people visited, many of whom were the children and grandchildren of those same Wehrmacht soldiers. The reactions ranged from shock and disbelief to outright denial, but the overwhelming evidence presented forced a national conversation on a topic that many had previously refused to acknowledge. One of the most haunting images was that of a German soldier aiming his rifle at a mother holding her child, moments before their execution. This photograph, taken by an anonymous soldier, contradicted any narrative that the Wehrmacht was merely a regular army not involved in the Nazi regime's genocidal policies. Such images served not only as historical evidence, but also as a brutal confrontation with the past, leading many to reevaluate their family histories. Eyewitness accounts and direct testimonies were also part of the exhibition. For instance, a diary entry from Corporal Max Taubner described the systematic shooting of Jewish civilians in Ukraine in 1941, detailing it as an act of cleansing and necessary punishment against Jewish subhumans. These personal accounts added layers of individual stories to the overarching narrative of complicity and guilt. Public forums and discussions accompanied the exhibition, where historians, survivors, and the general public debated the implications of these revelations. Notably, one visitor, Karl Schneider, whose father served in the Wehrmacht, shared in a recorded interview at the exhibition, "I came here looking for traces of my father. Instead, I found a truth that I am still trying to comprehend." The impact of the exhibition extended beyond Germany's borders, challenging other nations to re-examine their roles and responsibilities during the war. It also spurred academic research and led to the opening of previously closed archives, providing more comprehensive insights into the war and the Wehrmacht's role in it. As the German public was coming to terms with this unsettling truth, another layer of historical investigation was unfolding in Russia. The opening of Soviet archives in the post-Cold War era revealed files and documents that corroborated the photographic evidence shown in Hamburg, detailing even darker aspects of the Wehrmacht's operations in Eastern Europe. This cross-referencing of sources from different sides of the war provided a more nuanced understanding and affirmed the grim realities exposed by the exhibition. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 not only reshaped global politics, but also opened a trove of archives that were inaccessible to Western historians for decades. Among these records were convincing proofs that shattered the Clean Wehrmacht myth, detailed orders, correspondences, and eyewitness accounts that documented the Wehrmacht's involvement in war crimes, including the Holocaust. The opening of these archives revealed that far from being mere bystanders, many units within the Wehrmacht collaborated closely with the SS and participated actively in the execution of Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies. One poignant document found was a 1941 order from a Wehrmacht unit in Ukraine instructing soldiers to assist Einsatzgruppen, the notorious SS squads responsible for mass shootings of Jews. The order explicitly stated, "The Jewish Bolshevik system must be eradicated once and for all." Further evidence came from the personal diaries of soldiers and official military communications, which contained descriptions of mass shootings and the clear involvement of the German military in these operations. For instance, the diary of a Wehrmacht soldier named Helmut Gross vividly described the liquidation of a Jewish ghetto in Belarus, noting without emotion the systematic execution of men, women, and children. Historians also uncovered photographs taken by Wehrmacht soldiers themselves, which they sent home as war trophies. These images, stark and horrifying, showed Wehrmacht units posing proudly in front of massacred bodies, contradicting post-war claims of ignorance and non-involvement in such atrocities. These visual proofs, alongside written records, painted a gruesome picture of a military deeply embroiled in the Nazi regime's genocidal policies. Testimonies from survivors also began to surface with greater frequency and detail, supported by the newfound archives. A notable account from Elena K., a survivor from a small village near Kyiv, described how German soldiers rounded up her family and others, executing them in a nearby forest. She recalled, "They were not SS, they were regular soldiers, and they laughed as they herded us like cattle." With this overwhelming barrage of evidence, the narrative of the Wehrmacht's innocence began to crumble. Historians like Richard J. Evans and Anthony Beaver, utilizing these new resources, published comprehensive works that outlined the military's complicity. Their writings drew on the vast number of documents and personal accounts, providing a rigorous, detailed account of the Wehrmacht's role in the atrocities of World War II. The impact of these revelations was profound. Public perception shifted dramatically as the historical community and the wider world came to terms with the true extent of the Wehrmacht's involvement in Nazi war crimes. The myth of the Clean Wehrmacht could no longer withstand the barrage of evidence now laid bare for the world to see. With every uncovered order and each harrowing testimony, the facade crafted by post-war narratives and former Nazi generals crumbled, exposing the stark and uncomfortable truths of history. The noble Wehrmacht of Hollywood and Cold War mythology has been exposed as willing architects of genocide. From Halder's prison conspiracy to the opened archives, we've witnessed how power, politics, and propaganda nearly erased the testimony of millions of victims. The Clean Wehrmacht myth wasn't just a lie about the past, it was a theft of the future, stealing justice from the dead and truth from the living. Every time we accept the myth of just following orders, we write the next chapter of atrocity. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more World War II history. Thanks for watching.